All right, let's talk about what are called inverse functions. Now, in order for a function, okay, you have to start with a function. In order for a function to have an inverse, then it must be a one-to-one function. That means if you look at the graph, it must pass the horizontal line test. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to show you how you can actually take a function and you can find its inverse. So let me give you an example. Let's find the inverse of this function, f of x equals 2x minus 5. And we did this example earlier when we were talking about inverse relations. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to try and find the inverse of this function. So here are the steps. The first thing you do is you replace the f of x with y. So I put y here equals 2x minus 5. Then I create the inverse relation. What I do is I switch my y's to x's and I switch my x's to y's. Now what I do is I solve for y. So I need to isolate y by itself on one side of the equation. I will add 5 to both sides. And now I will take 2 and divide 2 on both sides. So I'm going to take x over 2 plus 5 over 2 equals y. And now over here I'll kind of clean that up. This means 1/2 of x plus 5/2 equals y. Or you could say y is equal to 1/2 x plus 5/2. Now what we do, since we found the inverse, is we replace the y not with f of x, but with this symbol, or with this notation. F raised to the negative 1 of x equals 1/2 x plus 5/2. And this is, I guess you could say this in English, f inverse of x equals 1/2 x plus 5/2. So we have found the inverse function. Now what I'd like to do is show you what the inverse function is actually doing. So let's look at this. Let's take this original function and let's imagine that we are going to take the number 1 and plug it into that function f and see what it would do with the number 1. So where would it take the number 1? Okay, 2 times 1 would give us 2, and then minus 5 would give us negative 3. So the function f, you put 1 in and it spits out negative 3 on the other side. Now what we're going to do is we want to know what function would take this back to 1. So what is the inverse function that would take negative 3 in and spit out 1? Well, look at this right here, this inverse function. Let's plug in negative 3. So I do 1/2 times negative 3 plus 5/2. Okay, that's negative 3 right there. Well, this is negative 3/2, right, plus 5/2. We already have a common denominator, so you do negative 3 plus 5, that's going to be equal to 2, and then over our common denominator 2, and 2 over 2 is equal to 1. So you can see that by plugging in negative 3 into that function, you go back to where you came from. So that's the idea of an inverse function. You start out with some function, the inverse function undoes that function.